Shalom. Thanks for joining me. I'm going to continue in Matthew chapter 12, picking up beginning in verse 15 and going through verse 21. This is the New International Version I'm teaching from. Aware of this, Jesus withdrew from that place, and many followed him, and he healed all their sick, warning them not to tell who he was. This was to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet Isaiah. Here is my servant whom I have chosen, the one I love, in whom I delight. I will put my spirit on him, and he will proclaim justice to the nations. He will not quarrel or cry out. No one will hear his voice in the streets. A bruised reed he will not break, and a smoldering wick he will not snuff out, till he leads justice to victory. In his name, the nations will put their hope. A quote directly from Isaiah chapter 42, verses 1 through 4. And I thought it would be interesting to compare and to read that verse. I'm going to read it from the Old Testament. It's still the NIV, though. It'll read just slightly different, but not much. Here is my servant whom I uphold, my chosen one in whom I delight. I will put my spirit on him, and he will bring justice to the nations. He will not shout or cry out or raise his voice in the streets. A bruised reed he will not break, and a smoldering wick he will not snuff out. In faithfulness he will bring forth justice. He will not falter or be discouraged until he establishes justice on the earth. In his law the islands will put their hope. I think it was interesting. Just a few slight differences between the New Testament quote versus what's in the Old Testament. That's because the difference between Hebrew versus Greek, and Matthew and Jesus' day and time, they quoted mostly from the Greek Septuagint instead of directly from the Hebrew scriptures. The passage I read in Isaiah reads a little differently because it's translated from Hebrew into English. And so there are a few differences, but some things that are very much important to notice, and this is really important. Jesus withdrew from the place where he had that confrontation of healing this man on the Sabbath day. And in the process, a lot of people followed him, and he healed all of those who were sick. And he warned them, don't tell them who I am. Now, I always found that interesting. Theologians refer to this as the messianic secret. And the idea behind this, most commentators say, Jesus was trying not to have such large crowds follow him so that he could effectively minister to people. There's a different passage in a different book. I forget which one. I think it's Luke, but don't quote me on that, where he could no longer enter certain cities anymore because the crowds were too big. So that's one of the reasons why he would say to tell people, don't advertise this a lot, don't tell this a lot, So that may have been one of the motives behind it, but who really knows? We're not really sure. There's no explanation why. But notice it said this healing was done to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet Isaiah. And if there's any one thing we know about Jesus, he was the fulfillment of prophecy. And notice this is the quote. The Father spoke this in Matthew 3:17. When Jesus was baptized, his voice came from the heaven, and he said, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." So here in Isaiah is these words again. Here is my servant whom I have chosen, the one I love, in whom I delight. Now, he puts the Spirit on him. Jesus, if there's any one thing that you can read, especially in the Gospel of Luke, Jesus was a Spirit-empowered man. And there's no question about the role of the Holy Spirit in Jesus' life, empowering him. He proclaims justice to the nations, it says in verse 18. The nations is a word for the Gentiles. which means, God all along had not only said, I'm going to bring the God, I'm going to choose the Jews to be my people, but I'm also going to use the Jews to proclaim my truth and justice to all the world, the nations, as it's referred to in the Old Testament. And notice Jesus is the kind of person Jesus was. It says he will not quarrel or cry out. No one will hear his voice in the streets. Jesus was not a shouting activist. He would not be one of these protesters in the middle of stuff that we see going on in modern day today. Notice in verse 20, a bruised reed he will not break, smoldering wick he will not snuff out. The kind of person Jesus was a healing person. He was an encouraging person. If you were on the edge, if you were suffering, if you were felt like you were too weak to go on, too tired, too worn out to go on, he would be there for you to encourage you, to strengthen you, to help you up. In fact, in chapter 11 was the great invitation he gave. Come to me, all of you who are weak and heavy burdened, and I will give you rest. That's the kind of man Jesus was. If you need encouragement, rather than just snuff you out, if you feel like you're worthless, if you feel like you're no good, Jesus will be there for you to strengthen you and encourage you and remind you, you are valuable. And the last thing is said, in his name, the nations will put their hope. And I am one of those who have put their hope in Jesus, the Jewish Messiah. So I'm a living fulfillment of that prophecy. And that's this section of Matthew chapter 12. Thank you for joining me.